The blade was already in the air when Talia Voss stopped thinking and started moving. She would replay that half-second for the rest of her life. The glint of silver catching the noon sun, the scream that hadn't left anyone's throat yet because no one else had seen it coming. And she would never be able to explain why her body simply refused to let it land where it was aimed. One moment she was balancing a tray of iced chamomile outside Marrow's diner, craning her neck like everyone else in Ironmoor Square to catch a glimpse of the royal procession. The next, she was airborne, tray clattering against the cobblestones, her shoulder driving into the side of a 12-year-old girl in a moon-white dress who had been laughing at something her father said only seconds before. The girl was Princess Elowen Thorn, only daughter of Alpha King Cassian Thorn, heir apparent to the Thornwood crown. And the blade meant for her throat buried itself instead in Talia's chest, just beneath her collarbone, with a sound like a wet branch snapping. For a moment there was no pain at all. There was only silence, the strange muffled silence of a world holding its breath. And then the square exploded into chaos. Guards shouting in the clipped, layered voices of lichen switching between human speech and something older. Something growled at the edges. Elowen was screaming her name. Not that she knew Talia's name yet, just screaming, wordless, her small hands fisted in Talia's apron. Somewhere behind them, the king's guard had already tackled a cloaked figure to the ground, silver manacles snapping shut with a hiss that meant they weren't taking chances on what kind of creature they'd caught. Talia looked down at the hilt protruding from her own body with a kind of distant, floating curiosity, as though it belonged to someone else. Huh, she thought. That's new. Then the pain arrived all at once, a tidal wave of it, and the world tipped sideways. 3 weeks earlier, Talia Voss had been nothing more than the fastest waitress at Marrow's diner, a girl the regulars liked because she remembered how they took their coffee and never asked questions about the things half of Ironmoor didn't ask questions about, like why old Hattie Marrow kept silver nailed over her back door, or why the moon sometimes drew certain customers away from their tables in the middle of a shift, apologizing over their shoulders, faces already changing shape before they made it out the door. Ironmoor sat on the border between the human townships of the lowlands and the ancestral territory of the Thornwood Pack, one of the few settlements in the kingdom where lichens and humans lived shoulder to shoulder, an arrangement forged 60 years ago, when King Cassian's grandfather signed the Concord that ended the last war. It was not always a comfortable arrangement. Old wounds healed strangely in a town like this, scarred over but tender to the touch, the kind of place where a human girl learned early which questions to swallow. Talia had grown up an orphan in Ironmoor, raised from the age of 6 by her great-aunt Josephine, a sharp-tongued woman who ran a modest herbalist shop 2 streets from the diner and who had never, in 18 years, given Talia a straight answer about her parents. They died before you could walk. That's all you need to carry, child. Josephine said it the way she said most things. Final, immovable, a door closed and locked. Talia had learned to stop knocking on it. What she had instead of a family history was a life built carefully out of small, dependable things. The diner's cracked leather booths, the particular ring of the bell over the door, the walk home past the old Duskwood shrine that nobody quite remembered the meaning of anymore, its carved wolf and star sigil worn nearly smooth by weather and time. She had her regulars. She had Hattie, gruff and kind in equal measure. She had, if she was honest with herself, a life too small for the restlessness she sometimes felt clawing under her ribs on full moon nights, though she had never once shifted, never once howled, never once been anything but entirely, unremarkably human. Or so she had believed. The procession that day had been a rare thing, the 10th anniversary of the renewed peace treaty between the Thornwood Pack and their old rivals, the Blackthorn Pack, a fragile truce that had cost both sides more blood than anyone liked to remember. King Cassian had chosen to mark it publicly, riding through Ironmoor with his daughter at his side, as a gesture of goodwill toward the human border towns, a king unafraid to walk among the people his family had once been at war to protect. It was meant to be a symbol. Instead, Within 30 seconds of the royal carriage passing Marrow's diner, it had become a crime scene. Talia had never planned to be a hero. She had simply looked up, seen a child in the path of something no one else had noticed yet, and moved. She woke to candlelight and the smell of crushed silver leaf, which meant she was either dead or somewhere expensive, because silver leaf balm cost more than she made in a month. She's awake. A voice, male, low, edged with something that might have been relief, or might have been fury. Talia's foggy brain couldn't yet tell the difference. Someone get the healer, now. She blinked up into unfamiliar dark eyes set in an unfamiliar striking face. A young man perhaps a few years older than her, dark-haired, with the particular stillness some lichens carried, the coiled patience of something that could move very fast if it needed to. He wore the deep green and silver of the Thornwood royal house, a signet ring on his hand shaped like a wolf mid-stride. "Where?" Talia's voice came out cracked, unused. Her chest throbbed with a deep, insistent ache that felt wrong in a way she couldn't name. Not the sharp agony of a fresh wound, but something more like a held breath finally releasing. "You're in the palace infirmary." The man's jaw was tight. "You took a blade meant for my sister." Sister. Talia's mind stumbled over the word, then landed on the crest on his collar, the wolf and crown sigil she'd only ever seen on coins and banners. This was no palace guard. "You're the crown prince," she said, which was possibly the least useful thing she could have said in that moment, but her body had apparently decided that stating the obvious was preferable to fainting again. "Kieran Thorne." He said it like an apology, as though his own name embarrassed him in the face of what she'd done. "And you very nearly died for a girl you'd never met. Is she—" Talia tried to sit up and regretted it instantly, a white-hot line of pain lancing through her shoulder. "Elowen is fine, untouched, because of you." Something flickered behind Kieran's eyes, something Talia would spend the coming weeks trying to name. Gratitude, yes, but also a wary, searching quality, as though he were looking at a puzzle whose pieces didn't fit the box they'd come in. "What I don't understand," he said slowly, "is how. How I moved fast enough. I don't know. I just... No." Kieran's gaze dropped deliberately to her collarbone, to the place where the blade had gone in. "How you're alive. That blade was forged silver, Miss Voss. Pure enough to kill any wolf in this kingdom in under a minute. A human should have simply bled to death from the wound itself, given how deep it went. You've done neither." Talia followed his gaze down to her own chest, to the wound the healers had bound in white linen, already, impossibly, knitting closed at the edges in a way that 18 years of ordinary humanity had never prepared her to explain. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Neither do I," said Kieran Thorne. And for the first time, something like fear moved behind his composed royal mask. "But I intend to find out. And so, I suspect, will several people in this palace who are far less kind about it than I am." Outside the infirmary window, the bells of Ironmoor's temple began to toll. Not the joyful clamor of a treaty anniversary, but the low, grave peal reserved for attempted murder against the crown. Somewhere in the palace's deepest cells, the hooded assassin sat in silver chains, saying nothing. And somewhere in a records room no one had opened in nearly 2 decades, a file marked Duskwood. Closed waited to be found. Talia Voss, who an hour ago had been carrying iced chamomile to table 6, closed her eyes against the ache in her chest and wondered, for the first time in her life, what exactly she was. Hattie Marrow arrived at the palace gates the following morning, having walked the entire distance from Ironmoor rather than wait for a carriage, and refused point blank to leave until she'd seen her girl with her own eyes. The guards, unused to a stout, flour-dusted diner owner planting herself in the middle of the royal courtyard and refusing to budge, eventually gave up and let her through, and Talia woke from an uneasy doze to find Hattie sitting stiffly in a chair meant for someone twice as important, glaring at the infirmary's silk curtains like they'd personally offended her. "You," Hattie said, "have exactly one job left in this world, which is to not scare me like that ever again." "I'll try," Talia rasped, and found, absurdly, that she was fighting back tears, not from the pain, which had dulled to something manageable, but from the simple, overwhelming relief of a familiar face in a place that suddenly felt very far from anything she recognized. Hattie took her hand and held it the way she used to when Talia was younger and homesick for parents she'd never known, and said nothing at all for a long while, which was, from Hattie, its own kind of eloquence. "They're saying strange things about you in town," Hattie said eventually. "Saying you're not entirely human. Saying the healers can't explain the wound. I don't know what I am, Hattie." "Well." Hattie squeezed her hand once, hard. "Whatever you are, you're still the girl who remembers that old man Cobb takes his coffee black with one sugar he pretends he doesn't want, and that's good enough for me. The rest, you'll figure out. You always land on your feet, even when you're throwing yourself in front of knives for princesses you've never met." She said the last part with a mixture of exasperation and fierce, undisguised pride that made Talia's throat go tight all over again. Before she left, Hattie paused at the door, looking back at the guards stationed outside with obvious suspicion. "That prince who keeps hovering in the hallway pretending to read reports," she said. "The dark-haired one. He's been standing out there since before I arrived, hasn't he?" Talia felt heat climb her neck. "I wouldn't know." Hattie's eyes narrowed with the particular knowingness of a woman who had watched several decades' worth of Ironmoor courtships unfold across her diner's booths. "Careful with royal boys, Talia. They come with crowns attached, and crowns have a way of making even good hearts do complicated things." It was, Talia would later think, the first warning anyone gave her about Kieran Thorne, and far from the last. The palace itself was a world Talia had only ever glimpsed from a distance, its spires visible from Ironmoor's town square on clear days, its banners a permanent fixture of the horizon, and yet entirely unknown to her in any way that mattered. Confined to the East Wing infirmary during her recovery, she nonetheless absorbed it in fragments. The low, constant murmur of lichen court business conducted in a formal cadence utterly unlike the plain speech of Ironmoor. The way servants moved through the halls with a wary, practiced deference that suggested court favor could curdle into court danger without warning. The enormous stained-glass window at the end of her corridor, depicting the signing of the original Concord, 60 years gone. 2 wolves. 1 thornwood green. 1 blackthorn iron gray. Locking jaws in a gesture that from a distance looked almost like a kiss, and up close looked exactly like what it was. 2 predators choosing deliberately not to tear each other apart. She thought about that window often in the days that followed. She would think about it a great deal more before the story was finished. The assassin captured in Ironmoor Square, she learned from an overheard exchange between 2 guards outside her door, had been identified as a disgraced Blackthorn mercenary named Osric Fenn, stripped of his pack rank years earlier for smuggling silver across the border. A detail the Crown's investigators found suspicious rather than conclusive, since silver smuggling was, as one guard put it dryly, a crime roughly as common in these border towns as jaywalking. Fenn had said nothing under formal questioning beyond a single chilling phrase, repeated whenever pressed. "I was paid to make sure Blackthorn took the blame. Nothing more." Paid by whom, he would not say, whether from loyalty, fear, or the simple fact that he did not himself know the true architect of the plot. It was a loose thread that would not stay buried for long. On her 6th night in the infirmary, unable to sleep, Talia asked Kieran the question she'd been circling for days without quite finding the nerve to voice it. "When you look at me," she said, watching him carefully in the low candlelight, "what do you see? Not the wound. Not the mystery everyone in this palace wants solved. Me." Kieran was quiet long enough that Talia thought he might deflect, the way royalty so often seemed trained to do. Instead, He set down the report he'd been pretending to read and looked at her properly, fully, in a way that made her breath catch. "I see someone who didn't hesitate," he said finally. "Not for a heartbeat. My sister has guards trained from birth to protect her, sworn oaths, years of drilling for exactly that moment, and not one of them moved as fast as a stranger with a tray of tea in her hands. I've spent my whole life around people who calculate first and act second, myself included, because that's what a crown teaches you. Weigh the cost, consider the optics, protect the treaty, protect the council, protect the peace. You didn't calculate anything. You just moved." He shook his head slowly, something raw and unguarded in his expression that she suspected he rarely let anyone see. "I don't know what bloodline runs in you, Talia Voss, but I know I have never in my life met anyone who acted so entirely without calculation, and I find I cannot stop thinking about what that means. Maybe it just means I'm reckless." "Maybe," Kieran allowed, the corner of his mouth finally softening into something like a smile. "Or maybe some things aren't reckless at all. Maybe they're simply true, faster than the mind can talk them out of being true." He held her gaze a moment longer than courtly propriety strictly allowed, then rose, gathering his reports with the sudden, flustered briskness of a man retreating from his own honesty. "Rest. Isolde will have my head if I keep you talking past the hour." He left, and Talia lay back against her pillows, one hand pressed lightly to the golden warmth beneath her collarbone, and thought that whatever answers the coming days held about bloodlines, and council seats, and a 19-year-old massacre, she was fairly certain now that at least one truth had already found her, quietly, in the space of a single unguarded conversation. And she was no longer entirely sure she wanted to talk herself out of it. The healer who finally arrived was an ancient bird-like lichen woman named Master Isolde, who took one look at Talia's wound, one look at the linens the palace attendants had already changed twice, and ordered every single person out of the room except Kieran. "You'll want to hear this, Your Highness," she said, in the tone of someone who had delivered unwelcome news to royalty for the better part of a century, and had long since stopped softening it. "Because I don't think your father is going to believe it from anyone but you." What Isolde had found, pressing careful fingers along the edges of Talia's wound, was a body doing something no purely human body should do, closing itself, cell by cell, at a rate that mirrored early-stage lichen healing almost exactly, except slower, hesitant, like an instrument being played by someone who had never touched it before. And beneath Talia's skin, faint as a heartbeat felt through a wall, Isolde swore she could feel something else. A second pulse. A low golden warmth that had no business existing in a girl with no wolf blood on either side of her family, so far as the Crown's records showed. "There are old bloodlines," Isolde said carefully, watching Talia's face as she spoke, "that don't announce themselves the way an ordinary shifter's blood does. Bloodlines that can lie dormant for a generation, 2 generations, waiting for something to wake them. A trauma, a first mate bond, a wound that should have killed." "Dormant bloodlines," Talia repeated numbly. "Like what?" Isolde exchanged a glance with Kieran that Talia didn't like at all. "Like Duskwood," the old healer said. The name meant nothing to Talia, and everything, apparently, to Kieran, whose expression shuddered so fast it was like watching a door slam. "That bloodline is extinct," he said. "Too quickly. It's been extinct for 19 years. "So we were told," said Isolde, and left it at that, gathering her things with the unhurried calm of a woman who had seen enough palace secrets to know which ones weren't hers to unravel. Over the following days, confined to the infirmary while her chest continued its strange, unhurried mending, Talia learned 3 things about Kieran Thorne that she filed away carefully. The way she'd once filed away, which regulars liked their coffee black. The first was that he visited every single day, always at dusk, always with some flimsy pretext. a report on Elowen's recovering nerves, a question about Talia's comfort, a book he thought she might like from the palace library, which turned out, upon inspection, to be a heavily footnoted history of border town herbalism that he clearly had chosen because he remembered, from some passing comment, that her great-aunt kept an apothecary. He was careful with her in a way that had nothing to do with pity, and everything to do with a kind of fierce, unspoken tenderness he seemed embarrassed to let anyone, including himself, examine too closely. The second was that he did not smile easily, but when Talia managed to surprise a laugh out of him, describing one evening the horror of trying to serve 6 tables at once during the diner's Sunday rush, while Hattie Marrow bellowed orders from the kitchen like a general commanding a losing battle. Something in his whole bearing loosened, the careful royal posture cracking just slightly to reveal a young man who had clearly spent most of his adult life being needed rather than being known. The third thing she learned, and this one she didn't file away so much as feel land somewhere low in her chest, unbidden. When Kieran was close to her, close enough that she could smell the cedar and rain on stone scent that seemed to follow him. Her strange new golden pulse, the one Isolde had found, beat harder, steadier, as though it recognized something in him that Talia's conscious mind hadn't caught up to yet. She did not have a word for that feeling. She suspected, from the way Kieran sometimes went very still and very quiet when he caught her looking at him, that he did. "You're not human," Elowen announced one afternoon, marching into the infirmary without knocking, evading her handmaidens with the practiced ease of a girl who had clearly done it many times before. She perched herself on the end of Talia's cot, 12 years old and entirely unbothered by royal protocol. Not fully, anyway. "My governess says the healers can't figure out what you are. I think it's exciting." "Your governess should mind her tongue around a child," Talia said, but she was smiling despite herself. There was something disarming about Elowen, a bluntness that cut through the careful, coded speech of the rest of the palace like a knife through silk. "She's not wrong to wonder, though, is she?" Elowen tilted her head, studying Talia with the unsettling directness only children and very old people seem to manage. "You jumped in front of a blade for someone you'd never met. That's not a human thing to do. Or a wolf thing, really. That's just a you thing." "Maybe I just didn't think fast enough to be scared." "Maybe," Elowen agreed, unconvinced. "Or maybe you're braver than anyone in this palace, including my brother, who once cried during his own coronation rehearsal because a pigeon startled him." "I did not cry," said Kieran from the doorway, deeply wounded, and Talia laughed for the first time since the blade had gone in, a real laugh, bright and surprised, and felt the golden pulse beneath her collarbone flare warm in response, as if it, too, were pleased. It was Elowen, in the end, who first said the word fated out loud. In the careless way children said dangerous things without understanding their weight. "You know what I think," the princess said one evening, swinging her legs against the side of the cot while Kieran pretended very hard to be absorbed in a treaty document he had brought purely as an excuse to stay in the room. "I think you're Kieran's mate. My nanny told me the signs, the way wolves go still when their mate's close, the way their eyes track them across a room even when they're trying not to look." She said it with the smug satisfaction of a child who has just solved a puzzle the adults were too dignified to name aloud. "You go still around him too, in case you hadn't noticed." "Elowen," Kieran said, in a strangled voice that did absolutely nothing to disprove his sister's theory. "I'm just saying," Elowen said, entirely unrepentant. "It would be a very good story. Waitress saves Princess. Princess's brother falls in love with Waitress. Everyone lives happily ever after, and Lord Vane stops looking like he swallowed a lemon every time anyone mentions you." That last part caught Talia's attention. "Lord Vane?" "My father's chief advisor," Kieran said, tone shifting, careful again in the way he got when the subject strayed toward the political. "He's been vocal about questions surrounding your survival. He believes the crown should be cautious about elevating an unknown human commoner to a position of court interest. given the ongoing investigation into the assassination attempt. "He thinks I'm involved," Talia said slowly, understanding dawning cold and unpleasant. "He thinks it's possible," Kieran corrected, though the correction did little to soften it. "The assassin captured that day has said nothing under questioning. Not his name, not his allegiance, nothing. Until we know who sent him and why, Vane believes every anomaly is suspect. And you, Miss Voss, are currently the largest anomaly in this palace." Talia thought of her great-aunt's locked door of a face. "They died before you could walk. That's all you need to carry, child." She thought of the Duskwood Name that made a healer go quiet and a prince's jaw go tight. She thought of a golden pulse beneath her ribs that had no business existing in an ordinary orphan girl from Ironmoor. "There's a fact I should probably know," she said, "about wolf bloodlines, about why a name that's supposedly extinct made everyone in this room flinch." Kieran was quiet for a long moment, weighing something, how much to tell her. Perhaps, or how much he was even permitted to. "The Duskwood line," he said finally, "was one of 6 ancient houses that held a hereditary seat on the Concord Council, the body that oversees treaty law between Thornwood and Blackthorn. 19 years ago, during a border skirmish that was supposed to have ended peacefully, the entire Duskwood household was slaughtered in a single night. Officially, it was blamed on Blackthorn raiders violating the treaty. The incident nearly restarted the war." "Officially," Talia repeated. "There were always rumors," Kieran admitted, "that the raiders were paid, that someone within Thornwood wanted the Duskwood seat empty and wanted the Blackthorn pack blamed for it, because a council seat with no heir reverts its voting power to whichever advisor the crown appoints as steward." Talia's mouth had gone dry. "Who's the current steward of the Duskwood seat?" Kieran's eyes met hers, dark and grim. "Lord Garrick Vane," he said. "Has been, for 19 years. It was around this time that Talia first met Lady Seraphine Ashcombe, and she came away from the encounter with a far more complicated impression than she had expected. Seraphine was the daughter of a powerful border noble house allied with Thornwood, and it had been an open, if unofficial, secret in the palace for over a year that the king favored a match between her and Kieran. A union that would strengthen the crown's ties to the Western Territories, at a moment when the treaty with Blackthorn remained fragile enough to need every ally it could gather. Talia had braced herself, hearing this, for a rival of the sort her aunt's penny romances had always promised. Cutting, jealous, quick with a cruel word disguised as a compliment. What she found instead, when Seraphine swept into the East Wing Gardens one afternoon to pay her respects to the princess's rescuer, was a young woman with tired eyes and a diplomat's careful composure, who looked at Talia not with jealousy, but with something closer to rueful recognition. "I understand congratulations may eventually be in order," Seraphine said, settling onto the garden bench with the practiced grace of someone who had spent her whole life being watched. "For what it's worth, Miss Voss, I bear you no ill will. I have known Kieran since we were children. I have watched the way he looks at you for exactly 4 days, and I have watched the way he never once looked at me that way in 11 years of formal introductions. I'm not fool enough to fight a mate bond. I've read the old texts. Fighting one is like fighting the tide. I never meant to complicate anything for you," Talia said, genuinely uncertain how to navigate a conversation she'd never imagined having. "You didn't complicate it. Vane did, the moment he started using my family's name to pressure the king toward a political match years before either Kieran or I asked for one." Something flickered across Seraphine's face, old resentment, carefully banked. "My father wants the alliance. I want, if I'm honest, considerably more freedom than a crown marriage would ever grant me. So you'll forgive me if I find your sudden arrival less an inconvenience and more of a reprieve." She rose to leave, then paused. "A word of caution, though, since I doubt anyone else in this palace will give it to you plainly. Garrick Vane does not lose gracefully. He has spent 19 years making sure no one asks difficult questions about the Duskwood seat, and you are, by your very existence, the most difficult question this court has faced in a generation. Watch yourself. It was, Talia thought as Seraphine disappeared back into the palace's shifting political currents, the strangest and most useful warning she'd received since waking in the infirmary. And it would not be the last time Seraphine Ashcombe proved to be an ally where a lesser story would have made her an enemy. Lord Garrick Vane, for his part, made his first direct approach 3 days later, arriving at Talia's chambers under the perfectly reasonable pretext of welfare inquiries owed to any guest recovering under Crown care. He was, in person, disarmingly pleasant, silver-templed, soft-spoken, the sort of man who had clearly built an entire career on being underestimated in rooms full of louder people. "I understand the healers remain baffled by your recovery," Vane said, settling into a chair he had not been offered, his eyes moving over Talia's chambers with the polite, cataloging attention of a man who missed very little. "It must be disorienting. One day an ordinary young woman serving tables in a border town, the next, the subject of council speculation and royal fascination. I confess I find the whole affair rather remarkable." "I find it rather inconvenient, my lord, if I'm honest." Vane's smile did not reach his eyes. "A refreshingly candid answer. Tell me, Miss Voss, has anyone in this palace mentioned to you the history of the Duskwood Name? I only ask because I would hate for you to be swept up in court gossip, without understanding the weight certain words can carry here. The Duskwood house was a tragedy this kingdom spent years recovering from. I would hate to see old wounds reopened carelessly, on the strength of rumor rather than proof." He rose to leave, smoothing his robes. "I mean that as a caution, not a threat, you understand. This court can be unkind to those who rise too quickly, for reasons real or imagined." After he'd gone, Talia sat very still for a long time, turning his words over. It had not sounded like a threat. It had sounded, she thought, exactly like the kind of thing a very careful man said when he wanted a threat delivered without ever once using threatening words. And she found, to her own surprise, that some new and unfamiliar instinct beneath her ribs, gold and warm and entirely unbidden, had gone very cold and very still the entire time he'd been in the room, the way a compass needle trembles near something that disturbs true north. She mentioned it to Kieran that evening, expecting reassurance. She did not entirely get it. "He's testing you," Kieran said grimly, after she'd relayed the conversation nearly word for word. "Gauging what you know, what you suspect, how much Isolde or Josephine or I may have already told you. Vane does not waste visits on idle curiosity." He was quiet a moment, jaw tight. "You should know that my father trusts him, has trusted him for 19 years. Vane has been a steady hand through 2 border crises and a near war that never happened, in no small part because of his counsel. If I accuse him of something this serious without proof, and I'm wrong, I don't merely embarrass myself. I hand every skeptic in this court a reason to distrust the very idea that a Duskwood heir could exist at all. We move carefully, Talia. We move only when we're certain. And if he moves first?" Kieran had no good answer for that, and they both knew it. Elowen found Talia alone in the palace library 2 nights later. Poring over the footnoted history of border herbalism Kieran had brought her weeks earlier, searching its margins for any mention of Duskwood healing traditions the healers might have missed. "You're worried," the princess observed, climbing onto the seat across from her without invitation, as was her habit. "You get a line right here." She tapped her own small forehead. "Kieran gets the exact same one when he's trying not to worry me." "I'm not used to being someone people worry about," Talia admitted. "Usually I'm the one doing the worrying, about rent, about Josephine's knees in winter, about whether the dinner rush would leave me any tips worth mentioning." "That sounds exhausting," Elowen said, with the blunt sympathy of a child who had never once had to consider rent. "For what it's worth, I'm not worried. You caught a blade meant for me without even knowing my name. I don't think Lord Vane or anyone else in this whole silly court stands much of a chance against someone like that." She said it simply, without performance, and Talia found the child's plain faith steadier, somehow, than any of the careful strategizing the adults around her kept offering instead. "Thank you," Talia said, and meant it more than the words could carry. "You're welcome," said Elowen, already sliding off her chair to chase down whatever new mischief awaited her elsewhere in the palace. "Also, you should marry my brother soon, because he's insufferable when he's in love and trying to hide it, and frankly, the whole palace would appreciate the relief." Talia was discharged from the infirmary a week later, her wound reduced to a thin silver-white scar and a persistent low warmth that never fully faded, and she was given a choice she hadn't expected. Return to Ironmoor and her old life at Marrow's diner, under crown protection, or remain at the palace while the investigation into the assassination continued, given that she was, whether she liked it or not, a material witness and a walking mystery the crown could not simply release into the wild. She chose to stay. She told herself it was because Josephine's shop was only a short ride away and she could visit. She told herself it was because she wanted answers about the pulse in her chest. She did not, in the privacy of her own thoughts, pretend for very long that Kieran Thorne had nothing to do with it. The trouble began exactly 9 days later, when Lord Garrick Vane requested a formal audience with the king to discuss what he termed the Duskwood Irregularity. Talia was not invited to that audience, which she understood, the moment Kieran told her about it afterward, was itself the first move in a game she hadn't realized she was playing. "He's proposing a formal inquiry," Kieran said, pacing the length of Talia's new chambers, modest ones, tucked in the palace's east wing, still grander than anything she'd lived in before. "Into your bloodline, your background, and your proximity to the assassination. He's arguing that a girl who survives a killing blow meant for the princess, who bears traits of a bloodline believed extinct, appearing at the exact moment of an unprecedented attack on the crown, is either the most extraordinary coincidence in Thornwood history, or not a coincidence at all. He thinks I orchestrated getting stabbed," Talia said flatly. "He thinks it's possible you're a plant. Someone raised in secret, positioned in Ironmoor for years, activated the moment it mattered, either to insert a Duskwood claimant back into council politics, or to create sympathy for the crown ahead of the treaty renewal, or simply to destabilize succession by raising unanswerable questions about bloodline and legitimacy at the worst possible moment." Kieran's hands had curled into fists at his sides. "It's a preposterous theory built entirely on fear of the unknown. But preposterous theories have toppled council seats before. And if it's proven false, then the inquiry ends, and Vane looks like a man who let paranoia embarrass the crown in front of Blackthorn dignitaries days before the treaty renewal ceremony." Kieran stopped pacing, finally, and looked at her with an intensity that made her golden pulse ache. "Talia, I don't believe a word of his theory. But I need you to understand what it would mean if the Duskwood bloodline in your blood is real, and if it's proven publicly, before we understand who's actually responsible for what happened to you. It would mean the Duskwood seat has an heir again," Talia said slowly, working it through, "and Vane would lose his stewardship. It would mean," Kieran said, "that the man who has controlled a council vote for 19 years, who has grown enormously wealthy brokering the weapons contracts that flow through that vote every time tensions with Blackthorn flare, suddenly has a very strong motive to make sure you never live long enough to formally claim it." The room went cold around Talia in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. "He tried to kill her," she said. "Elowen. That's what this is about, isn't it? Not just the treaty. Something bigger." "I don't know yet," Kieran admitted, "but I intend to find out. And I would very much prefer to find out before Vane finds a second assassin, more competent than the first." The specific fact came from an unlikely source: Josephine. Talia rode to Ironmoor under a Thornwood escort 3 days later, ostensibly to collect belongings from her old room above the apothecary, and found her great-aunt waiting at the door with an expression Talia had never once seen on the old woman's face in 18 years. Fear. "You've been to the palace," Josephine said, before Talia had even dismounted. "You've been asking about Duskwood. How do you know that name?" Josephine's jaw worked for a long moment, the door of her face finally creaking open. "Because your mother's name was Wilhelmina Duskwood," she said, "and I have spent 19 years praying you'd never need to know it." What followed was the story Josephine had buried for nearly 2 decades. That Talia's parents had not died in some anonymous accident, as she'd always been told, but had been among the last survivors of the massacre that ended the Duskwood house. Smuggled out of the burning household as infants in arms by a single loyal steward, split up and scattered to different corners of the kingdom to protect them from whoever had ordered the killing. Talia's mother had lived only 2 more years, dying of injuries she'd never fully recovered from, and had left her infant daughter with Josephine, a distant cousin by marriage, with one instruction: tell her nothing until she's grown, and even then, only if she asked the right questions. "There was a specific detail your mother made me memorize," Josephine said, her hands trembling as she pressed a small, tarnished locket into Talia's palm, the Duskwood sigil, wolf and star, engraved on its face, the same worn symbol from the shrine near Talia's old apartment. The Duskwood bloodline carries what the old texts call the Moonfire gift, the ability to heal wounds that would kill an ordinary lichen, wounds inflicted by silver most of all, because Duskwood blood was said to run counter to silver's poison, rather than succumbing to it. It's why the house was valued on the council for centuries. Duskwood healers ended more border skirmishes through treaty mediation than any army ever did. "And it's exactly," Josephine said grimly, "the kind of gift that makes a bloodline dangerous to certain people, if that bloodline is ever restored to influence." Talia thought of the blade that should have killed her and hadn't. She thought of a golden pulse that answered to Kieran Thorne's nearness like a compass finding north. She thought of 19 years of silence, and a name on a records file marked closed, and a man who had built a fortune on a council seat that was never rightfully his. "I need to go back," she said. Now. She arrived at the palace to chaos. The formal inquiry had been moved up. Vane, it turned out, had petitioned the king directly, invoking an obscure Concord clause that allowed any council steward to demand an emergency tribunal when the legitimacy of a hereditary seat was publicly called into question, which Talia's own absence from the palace, conveniently, had allowed him to frame as evidence of flight. By the time Talia's escort reached the palace gates, a tribunal had already been called for the following evening. Timed, not by accident. Kieran was certain, to coincide with the arrival of the Blackthorn delegation for the treaty renewal ceremony, guaranteeing an audience of foreign dignitaries for whatever verdict Vane intended to engineer. "He's not trying to prove you're a fraud," Kieran said grimly, reading the tribunal summons with a face gone pale with fury. "He's trying to prove it publicly, in front of Blackthorn. At the exact moment it will do the most damage, either to you or to the treaty itself, or both. A scandal involving a supposedly resurrected bloodline, timed to a peace ceremony, would hand any faction in Blackthorn that still wants war exactly the pretext they need to walk away from the table. So what happens to me if I can't prove what I am?" Kieran's silence was answer enough. "And if I can prove it?" "Then Vane loses a council seat he's held for 19 years, along with every weapons contract that seat has quietly protected," Kieran said. "And a man like that does not lose gracefully." The chaos of the tribunal's rescheduling was compounded, that same evening, by the arrival of the Blackthorn delegation, a full day ahead of schedule. A break in protocol that set the entire palace on edge until its cause became clear. Commander Aldane, leading the Blackthorn envoys, had apparently heard rumors of the Duskwood matter from informants along the border, and had ridden through the night specifically to arrive before the tribunal convened, rather than after. "I did not come early to interfere," Aldane told Kieran and Talia bluntly, when Kieran granted him an audience out of simple respect for Blackthorn rank. He was a broad, scarred man with none of Vane's practiced smoothness, and Talia found she trusted him more in 5 minutes than she'd trusted the council steward in 3 visits. "I came early because my grandfather commanded the raid 19 years ago that has haunted my house's name ever since. And if there is truth to be found about who truly paid for Duskwood blood, I would see it found before some noble steward buries it a second time to save his own seat." He studied Talia with unhidden curiosity. "My grandfather went to his grave, insisting Blackthorn hands never touch that household. He was called a liar by his own advisors for saying so. If you are who the rumors claim, Miss Voss, you may be the only proof that dying an honest man in Blackthorn ever bought him." It was, Talia thought, the first time she understood the shape of what was truly at stake. Not merely her own legitimacy, or even Vane's downfall, but 19 years of a wrongly accused pack's grief, waiting quietly for a truth no one had been brave enough, or powerful enough to force into the light. Vane, for his part, was not idle in the hours after Aldane's arrival became known. Talia learned secondhand, through Seraphine, that he had spent the afternoon moving quietly between the chambers of 6 minor council lords, framing the coming tribunal not as a question of Talia's legitimacy at all, but as a question of crown stability, arguing, with his usual velvet persuasion, that restoring a council seat on the word of an elderly herbalist and a Locket, on the eve of a treaty renewal, risked handing skeptical factions within Blackthorn a public spectacle to mock, rather than a peace to celebrate. It was, Seraphine reported grimly, working on at least 2 of the more cautious lords, men who valued the appearance of stability over the discomfort of truth. "He's not trying to win the tribunal outright," Seraphine warned. "He's trying to make enough of the council afraid of the outcome that they'll vote to delay it indefinitely, bury the question in procedure rather than risk answering it. A postponed inquiry serves him just as well as a failed one. Perhaps better, since a delay draws no attention at all." That understanding nearly cost her everything less than an hour later. She was crossing the palace's western colonnade alone, having slipped away from her escort to walk off the noise in her own head, when a figure detached itself from the shadow of a support column with the deliberate, unhurried motion of someone who had been waiting. Talia's newly awakened instinct screamed a warning half a second before her conscious mind registered the glint of a blade, not silver this time, but a hunting knife, crude and fast, meant to look like an opportunistic robbery gone wrong rather than a second assassination attempt. She moved without thinking, the same reflex that had thrown her in front of Elowen's blade weeks before, twisting away from the strike hard enough that the blade caught only fabric instead of flesh. And then Kieran was there. She never afterward knew how he'd found her so quickly, whether scent or bond or simple royal instinct, moving faster than she'd ever seen a person move, driving her attacker into the colonnade's stone wall with a force that ended the confrontation in under 10 seconds. The man was a palace groundskeeper, it turned out, one who had worked the Western Gardens for 6 years without incident, and who, under questioning, broke down within the hour and admitted he'd been paid an amount equivalent to a decade's wages by an intermediary. He'd never seen clearly, with instructions to make Talia's death look like a robbery should the opportunity present itself before the tribunal. "He doesn't know who hired him," Kieran said afterward, pacing Talia's chambers with barely restrained fury, his hands still faintly trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline. "Only that the coin was real and the instructions were specific. Which means Vane's grown desperate enough to try twice," Talia finished. "And careless enough that eventually, one of the men he pays is going to talk." "Or careful enough," Kieran said grimly, "that he'll simply stop delegating and try himself, the next time he judges the stakes worth the risk." That night, alone in her chambers under guard thick enough to make the corridor outside feel like a garrison, Talia opened her mother's locket for the first time and found, tucked behind the tiny portrait inside, a folded scrap of paper so old it nearly crumbled at her touch. A single line in a woman's careful hand. The words Wilhelmina Duskwood had apparently thought important enough to preserve for a daughter she'd known she wouldn't live to raise. The fire that took our house was set by Thornwood coin, not Blackthorn hands. Trust the wolf who finds you, not the crown that failed us. Talia sat with that sentence for a long time, the golden pulse in her chest beating steady beneath her fingers, and understood, with sudden and terrible clarity, that tomorrow's tribunal was not the true danger at all. The true danger was whatever Garrick Vane intended to do if he suspected, even for a moment, that the tribunal might not go his way. The great hall of Thornwood Palace had been built to hold peace treaties and coronations, its vaulted ceiling strung with banners in Thornwood green and Blackthorn iron gray for the first time in a decade. And it was into this hall, packed with dignitaries from both packs and half the noble houses of the kingdom, that Talia Voss walked the following evening to answer for the crime of surviving. Lord Garrick Vane stood at the tribunal dais already, resplendent in council robes, his composure so smooth and practiced that Talia understood, watching him, exactly how he had held power unquestioned for 19 years. He did not look like a murderer. That, she thought, was precisely the point. "Miss Voss," Vane began, once the formalities were dispensed with, his voice carrying easily across the hushed hall. "You survived a killing blow from a silver blade. You bear a scar consistent with ancient healing texts describing the so-called Moonfire gift, unique to the Duskwood bloodline. And you appeared, remarkably, at the precise moment and location required to intercept an attack on the Crown Princess. I ask the Council in this assembly plainly, what are the odds of such a convergence occurring by chance?" "I don't know the odds, my lord," Talia said, her voice steadier than she felt. "But I know the truth, if you'll let me speak it." She told them everything. Josephine's confession, the locket, the massacre 19 years ago that had orphaned an infant girl and scattered her mother's bloodline to protect it from whoever wanted it destroyed. She held up the tarnished locket, the wolf and star sigil catching torchlight, and watched several older council members go pale with recognition. "A moving story," Vane said smoothly when she finished. "But a story is all it is. A locket proves nothing. A dying woman's dying wish, relayed secondhand by an elderly herbalist, proves nothing. I would remind the Council that convenient timing and sentimental narrative have never once been sufficient legal standard for restoring a hereditary seat. Particularly not." His eyes flicked, deliberately toward the Blackthorn delegation, when the restoration in question would require this assembly to publicly revisit the question of who truly bore responsibility for the Duskwood massacre, at the precise moment this kingdom is attempting to celebrate peace with the very pack once blamed for it. It was a masterful move, and Talia saw, in the shifting unease among the Blackthorn dignitaries, exactly how close it came to working. Vane wasn't merely discrediting her, he was weaponizing the discomfort of the entire room, making the truth itself sound like an act of sabotage against the treaty. "There is a way to settle this beyond doubt," said King Cassian Thorn, rising from his seat for the first time, his voice carrying the particular authority that silenced even a hall full of nervous dignitaries. The old Duskwood healing texts describe the Moonfire gift as manifesting specifically and only in response to silver. If Miss Voss carries true Duskwood blood, she need not rely on lockets or stories to prove it. He held out one gloved hand, and a guard stepped forward bearing a small ceremonial blade, silver, unmistakably, the royal armory's oldest and purest, and offered it hilt first to Talia. The hall went utterly silent. "Your Majesty," Kieran said sharply, stepping forward from where he'd stood near the dais. "You cannot ask her to wound herself in front of—" "I can," Talia said, cutting him off gently, her eyes never leaving the blade. "And I will." She drew the silver edge, shallow but real, across her own forearm, and the entire great hall watched in collective, breathless silence as the wound sealed itself closed within seconds. the skin beneath knitting whole and unmarked, the faint gold shimmer of moonfire, visible even from the farthest benches. Commander Aldane rose from among the Blackthorn delegation before Vane could press his advantage further, his scarred face grim in the torchlight. "My Lord Vane speaks of convenient timing," he said, his voice carrying the flat authority of a man unaccustomed to being doubted in his own hall, let alone another pax. "I would remind this assembly that my grandfather spent the last years of his life insisting Blackthorn hands never touch the Duskwood household, and died disbelieved by his own advisors for it. If there is a chance, however inconvenient to this ceremony's timing, that the truth of that night might finally be known, I would see my grandfather's name cleared before I would see this council protect a steward's comfort over 19 years of my own pack's wrongful shame. I did not ride ahead of my delegation for theater, Lord Vane. I rode to hear the truth, whatever it costs any of us." A murmur swept the hall, the specific, dangerous murmur of a room realizing that the political ground beneath a powerful man had just shifted without his permission. Vane's composure, Talia noticed, held for perhaps 3 more seconds before the first genuine crack appeared in it. "There is a way to settle this beyond doubt," said King Cassian Thorne, rising from his seat for the first time, his voice carrying the particular authority that silenced even a hall full of nervous dignitaries. The old Duskwood healing texts describe the moonfire gift as manifesting specifically and only in response to silver. If Miss Voss carries true Duskwood blood, she need not rely on lockets or stories to prove it. He held out one gloved hand, and a guard stepped forward bearing a small ceremonial blade, silver, unmistakably, the royal armory's oldest and purest, and offered it hilt first to Talia. The hall went utterly silent. "Your Majesty," Kieran said sharply, stepping forward from where he'd stood near the dais. "You cannot ask her to wound herself in front of—" "I can," Talia said, cutting him off gently, her eyes never leaving the blade. "And I will." She drew the silver edge, shallow but real, across her own forearm, and the entire great hall watched in collective, breathless silence as the wound sealed itself closed within seconds, the skin beneath knitting whole and unmarked, the faint gold shimmer of moonfire, visible even from the farthest benches. Several older council members, Talia noticed, pressed hands to their mouths in open astonishment. One elderly woman in thornwood robes began, quietly, to weep, murmuring a name. Wilhelmina. That had clearly not been spoken aloud in that hall for 19 years. It was, in the end, Vane's own overreaction that undid him. "This proves nothing," he snapped too quickly, too loudly, stepping down from the dais with a fury that shattered his careful composure for the first time all evening. And in doing so, in the sudden urgency of a man watching 19 years of stolen power slip away in front of foreign dignitaries, he made the single mistake Kieran had been waiting for. He reached into his robes. "Guards!" Kieran was already moving, already between Talia and the dais, as Vane's hand closed on something metallic beneath his council robes. A second blade, silver, clearly meant to finish, in front of the entire court. What the first assassin had failed to do in Ironmoor Square. He never reached her. The king's guard took him down before the blade cleared his robes, and in the chaos that followed, shouting. The Blackthorn delegation's honor guards drawing weapons out of pure reflex before their own commander barked them still. A second man was seized trying to slip out through a side door. A council scribe who, under the weight of Vane's public unraveling and the promise of leniency, confessed within the hour to everything, that Vane had orchestrated the original Duskwood massacre 19 years ago through paid Blackthorn mercenaries, ensuring the seat's stewardship and its lucrative weapons contracts would fall to him indefinitely. That he had learned, only weeks ago, of rumors regarding a surviving Duskwood heir living quietly in Ironmoor, and had hired the assassin at the treaty ceremony not merely to kill the princess and reignite profitable hostilities with Blackthorn, but to eliminate, in the same act of chaos, Any chance that a restored Duskwood claimant might one day challenge his authority, never suspecting that the girl who would step into the Blade's path to save Elowen was the very heir he'd spent 19 years hunting. Lord Garrick Vane was stripped of his council stewardship, his titles, and his lands before the week was out. Remanded to face judgment under both Thornwood and Concord law for treason, conspiracy, and the murder of an entire noble house. The Blackthorn delegation, rather than using the scandal as pretext to abandon the treaty, used it instead to formally exonerate their own people of a massacre they had been wrongly blamed for across 2 decades. A gesture that did more to cement the renewed peace than any ceremony could have, built as it finally was on truth instead of convenient silence. Talia Voss was formally recognized before the full council as the last living heir of House Duskwood, her mother's seat restored to her, her mother's name spoken aloud in the Great Hall for the first time in 19 years without flinching. Commander Aldane requested, and was granted, a formal copy of the scribe's confession to carry home to his own pack's elders. Proof, finally, that his grandfather had died an honest man wrongly disbelieved. A small and overdue mercy that did more to soften Blackthorn hearts toward the renewed treaty than a decade of careful diplomacy had managed. Lady Seraphine Ashcombe, freed at last from a political match she had never wanted, negotiated her own quiet arrangement with the king in the weeks that followed, a formal role advising the crown on western border trade, a position that suited her considerably better than a wedding gown ever would have, and she and Talia remained, against every expectation either of them had walked into that garden conversation with, genuine friends. Josephine, for her part, refused outright to leave her apothecary for palace life, though she did finally, grudgingly, allow Talia to install proper wards of Duskwood silver ash over the shop's door. "Not because I need protecting," she insisted, "but because you'll fret otherwise, and fretting is worse for my nerves than any assassin." Elowen declared herself personally responsible for the entire outcome, on the grounds that she had correctly identified the mate bond a full 2 weeks before either Talia or Kieran had the courage to name it themselves, and no one in the palace found much grounds to argue with her. She did not, in the end, choose to disappear into a quiet life of council politics, though the seat was hers to claim. She chose, instead, something Elowen had predicted with the smug certainty of a 12-year-old who had seen the truth before anyone else in the palace was willing to name it out loud. "I believe," Kieran Thorne said, some weeks later, standing with Talia in the same square outside Marrow's diner, where a blade had once found her instead of a princess, "that I owe you a debt I can't ever properly repay." You could try anyway," Talia said, smiling, the gold warmth beneath her collarbone steady and sure, no longer strange to her, no longer unnamed. "I could," Kieran agreed, and knelt, right there on the cobblestones where she'd once dropped a tray of iced chamomile to save a girl she'd never met, and asked her to be his mate, his equal, his Lady Duskwood restored. Not because a bloodline demanded it, but because some things, once found, refused to be lost again. Talia Voss, once simply the fastest waitress in Ironmoor, looked down at the man kneeling before her in the exact spot where her old life had ended, and her true one had finally begun, and thought of her mother's line, folded so carefully behind a locket for 19 patient years. "Trust the wolf who finds you." "Yes," she said, and somewhere above them, faint and golden, the moon that had waited 19 years to claim her seemed at last to approve. The blade meant for a princess had struck a waitress instead, and in doing so had finally set free the truth an entire kingdom had spent 19 years trying to bury. Marrow's diner reopened its doors on Talia's wedding day, at Talia's own insistence, because some traditions were worth keeping even after everything had changed. Hattie stood behind the counter in her good apron, muttering about royal guards tracking mud across her clean floors, and old Cobb took his coffee black with one sugar he still pretended he didn't want, and outside the window, banners in Thornwood green and Blackthorn iron gray hung side by side above Ironmoor Square, for the first time in living memory, no longer symbols of a fragile truce, but of a peace finally built on truth instead of silence. Talia thought, watching Kieran cross the square toward her in the golden late-afternoon light, of the girl she'd been only months before, fast on her feet, quick with a coffee pot, entirely unremarkable by every measure she'd ever been taught to judge herself by, and understood at last that she had never needed a bloodline or a council seat to prove what she already was. The seat and the name were simply the truth catching up to her, slower than her own instincts had ever been. She thought, too, of her mother's line, worn soft now from how many times she'd traced it with her thumb. Trust the wolf who finds you. She had. And in trusting him, she had found not only a mate, but a mother's name, a house restored, and a peace that would outlast them both. Somewhere above Ironmoor, the moon rose pale and patient, exactly as it had on the night 19 years ago when a house had burned, and an infant girl had been carried, unknowing, into a life that would eventually lead her back to this square, to this diner, to this blade-shaped scar just beneath her collarbone that she had long since stopped hiding. She had been struck by a blade meant for someone else, and it had given her back everything that had been stolen from her before she'd been old enough to know its name. What? She wondered, smiling as Kieran reached her and took her hand in the fading light. Would the two of them build now, with the truth finally theirs to keep?